For our listeners, this is a content warning. Throughout this podcast, we touch on subjects related to trauma, misogyny, racism and medical racism, sexual misconduct, residential schools, as well as many aspects of death and dying. Should you need them, there is a list of resources in our show notes. Most importantly, as you listen, take a break when you need to, and please take care of yourselves. We'd like to acknowledge that this podcast is produced and recorded across the land known as Canada. These traditional and treaty territories are full of rich Indigenous histories, home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We embrace the opportunity to share this story in a respectful, inclusive, and culturally appropriate way.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Before I Go. Hi, Mom. How are you?
Hi, Daniel. I'm really well. I mean, I try to respond to sort of all parts of myself when somebody asks me that question, because, it's one of those questions going, hey, how are you? No, I'm fine. Thanks. How are you? But stopping and taking the time to think about, what does that mean? How am I doing? I tend to think that we work a little bit too hard. We have a few too many things on our plate. And, I tend to think that sometimes the universe just kind of tells us to slow down. And so I had mentioned that we didn't get a contract that we were hoping for, but it's okay. That's okay. We have to slow down. We have to take time to look after ourselves, and we have to spend time with our family. And, work isn't everything. I told people that, the downside of finding the miracle drug that changes my life is that I blew the retirement fund. That I thought I had a year left to live, so I was making memories with my family, and now I'm going to work till the day I die. And oh my God, man, it's like, what an amazing problem to have. So yeah, I think part of the issue is that it's just a reminder that we don't need to always work. How are you, Danielle?
I'm good. I mean, whenever we do these podcasts, there's a sense of grounding that comes with it because, like you said, it's it's a race out there, you know, to work, to balance with family, to balance with friends, but to truly be present with people, for this set amount of time. I don't know, there's just a peace that comes with it, coming into this new season. And yeah, I just really appreciate that because to be able to sit down and have genuine, authentic conversations with people, to learn, to grow, to evolve, to experience life from another perspective. I'm eternally grateful for that, and I'm also grateful for our guest. So, can you introduce yourself, where you're calling from?
Sure. Yeah. My name is Jeffrey Ansloos. I'm calling today from Toronto on Dish with One Spoon territory on the Great Lakes. But home is actually in Manitoba, where my family's from. On my mom's side of the family, from Fisher River Cree Nation. And My relatives are kind of spread all across southern Manitoba and the Interlake region, but I grew up in Winnipeg, so that's home for me.
Hmm, nice. So, can you tell us what you do for your career?
Sure. Yeah. So I am what do you call it? I'm kind of a jack of all trades these days. I'm a full-time professor at the University of Toronto, where I research and teach and supervise graduate students in the area of Indigenous health and social policy. I'm the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Studies of Health, Suicide Studies, and Environmental Justice. Um, I also work as a psychologist at Makwa, which is the Indigenous Clinical Service at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. And yeah, those are my main things. And when I have a little bit of spare time, I also like to write children's books. And I've written a really fun children's book with my mom recently called Thunder and the Noise Storms, and am enjoying getting to be able to read these books to my 1-year-old daughter, Asha.
Oh, that's amazing. When we were looking for potential guests for this season, it the theme started to emerge, and
Mm,
justice was part of it. And a
mm,
huge part of this platform, of this journey, is, exploring, you know, racism, exploring environmental racism, and pretty much all the isms, that we still face on a day-to-day basis as Indigenous people in this country. But as we started to think about where are we going with this, with these conversations, with this platform, like I said, justice seemed to be the theme that we were looking at,
mm, mm,
and you and your work, um, yeah, it was just really inspiring how you wanted to weave together, this sense of justice, mental health, working with youth, you know. So can you share a bit about, how you got into this? This
mm.
jack of all trades, there's a lot of themes that you're covering, but what inspired
Mm.
you to get into it?
That's a great question. I feel like when people ask me that question, my answer is evolved um, little by little. I think I found my work and my pathway to my work uh, probably through. It's funny. I'm going to talk about my mom a lot today, but the mentorship and the care of my mom. My mom was a teacher in elementary and middle and high schools. She became a guidance counselor and then a principal, and she was involved in supporting young people her whole career. She still does that in different ways. Um, and I think growing up, I was always aware that her work as an educator was work for our community. It was work that really was trying to meet the needs of young people and their families, particularly First Nations, um, Inuit and Métis, young people living in Winnipeg. Um, and I know that that passion, that care came to her through her own life and experiences of education and the isms that happen in these systems. Um, and I think, yeah, that's what drew me to education and learning, and then I think I really wanted to be of practical use because the young people that I was working with very early when I was in university, I was a part-time a youth worker. I started seeing the impact of mental health on young people, and I wanted to be of practical use, trying to think through ways of supporting their yeah their well-being. Um, And I thought, oh, I should become a psychologist. Maybe that's something that'll be very helpful for our people. It sounded good, maybe too good to be true. Because as I got into the work and got into learning, I realized that these fields of healthcare practice and mental health care were not actually designed often with our communities in mind, or really the tools that they provided were not always designed to really meet the needs of our communities or developed with our cultural assumptions and perspectives at the forefront. And so, yeah, it was never quite a perfect fit. And I had to do a lot of work to sort of understand what were the good pieces of this work and what were the pieces that I needed to let go of to be of better use to our community. But that's kind of how I found myself there. And I also think out of my own need for healing, I think drew me to the work of mental health in a way. Um, in some ways that are very like, we're all learning and growing. But as a young person, I certainly struggled with my sense of purpose and meaning in living. I think struggled with the question of staying alive. And I think I came to this work because I was hurting and in need of healing too. That's the honest truth. It's maybe not the most professional answer to give, but I think I found a great deal of hope in the work that I came to do, and reasons for living in that work.
I think that's amazing because it kind of falls into if you get a diagnosis of something, and primarily around a mental health diagnosis. If they give you a diagnosis, you get your diagnosis, you learn as much as you can, then you put it aside. And that's
Mhm.
kind of how I dealt with my own education, going to university and things like that. I take what works because Indigenous people, we do not fit into those spaces all the time.
Mm,
And I think if you're looking at it, from a psychologist point of view, then I think you have to take in all parts of yourself. That
mhm,
includes those parts that your mother has handed down to you. And
mhm,
as an educator, what a great place to start.
mhm,
Mhm. No, and I definitely relate to the trying to fit yourself into systems that aren't built for you
mm,
and almost feeling like it's traumatizing you. Because I trained in mental health, I trained as a counselor,
mm,
and right out of school, went to the downtown east side in Vancouver and was trying to teach nonprofit organizations between the link between homelessness and the history of residential schools.
mhm,
But what they don't teach you in school is how to protect yourself.
mm,
So the burnout rate, incredibly high. So, yeah, going into these universities, going into these organizations, going into these systems, like you said, weren't built with our Indigenous values, teachings, practices in mind.
mhm,
I don't know. I think there's a sense of harm there, because,
mhm,
like you said, you try to show up in these spaces, you know, either personally, professionally, academically, you know, and so how do you deal with that? What
Well,
steps are you taking to, I don't know, what's the term for it? Decolonize your space?
well, I think failing at that question is really how I've learned the most. Like, I think I've experienced burnout or anger or resentment in my work. Truthfully, it's not always easy to do that work under those conditions. Um, but I think there's also those moments of burnout or those experiences of grief or loss in the work that you're doing. I think also can be a slowing down time of recalibrating and resetting. Um, I don't know. I think I really like this thing. I think it's Deb McGregor who first taught me through her writing about the Anishinaabe creation stories, and her point is that they're plural, and that for as many times as we start over, there have been endings. And I think one of the things I've had to do is break up with and restart my relationship to my work many times over. And sometimes, yeah, recognizing that certain environments are not good for me to work in is one. But I think also recognizing that to do the justice kind of focused work that I care most about means making my heart work happen close to places of great harm. like to address the impacts of racism or to address the impacts of colonialism. um, to pursue justice for our communities means we have to go right into the place where some of the greatest trauma and harm has happened or is continuing to happen. And so you need something in that work that grounds you and sustains you and helps you create new life in places that have actually tried to extinguish life. Um,
Mhm.
and so, yeah, I mean, I've learned through failing at that. I've learned through having to reset relationships or having to come back to what are the most core important values of the work that I do. Um,
Mhm.
I also think we fight for the things we love. We love, and so I think sometimes good work in pursuit of justice for our communities means um, like advocacy and fighting hard for the things that matter most. Um, but we have to match our fight with our rest, and we have to match our um, commitments to boundaries to being bounded in deep community. And yeah, I think those sorts of practices have really helped me. Um, and all the good stuff too, like laughter, like taking a break, like a good vacation now and then, and keeping
Mhm.
keeping keeping a good reminder too that it can't all fall on one person, but that we work across communities, across generations, and that change will far exceed my lifetime. Um,
Yeah, yeah. Part of I love that you're talking about your values and how you take care of yourself in those spaces. But one of the things that we, keep talking about, especially on this podcast, is why are we here? Why does
mm,
this podcast exist? Why does this platform exist? And why do we work to keep it going? And it's because Indigenous peoples across this country are still dealing with issues. We're still dealing
mhm,
with with systemic racism. We're still dealing with intergenerational trauma, and so I was just hoping you can go into kind of, yeah, those passions. You're talking about
mhm,
justice. What do those
mhm,
areas look like? What are you dealing with right now?
mhm,
Oh, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt here, but I just want to respond to a couple of things that you did bring up, and I love the fact that you match your fight with your rest. That's something that we have to learn because there. How do you keep from burning out? Because there were times in my life where rest was deemed as lazy,
mm,
and I think with the generations who taught me that were the generations who had to get up. Life was labor intensive. You had to get up with the sun and you had to get out and hunt or fish or gather or whatever you needed to do in order to exist. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. And so we don't live in that time anymore. So one thing we tried to do in my family is sort of redefine rest. Somebody sleeps in and it's like, oh, good, I'm glad you needed the rest.
mm,
And I think it's important for us to redefine that because you also brought up, breaking up with your career. One of the things I think that does is that gives us agency. It gives us choice. The things we do in our life, we do because we choose to do them. Nobody has that power over you to make you do something that you're not, you know, that you don't want to do. And the only thing
mhm,
I would say is that even though you said you failed, I mean, part of what it is that you define failure. And with my children, it was, you know what? As long as you keep going, you didn't fail. You might
mm,
not get it the first time. You might fall over. It might blow up in your face, but, pick it up and keep going.
mm,
And so redefining what that is, important because those things that you touched on and being able to rest and to be able to have the agency and choice to say, you know what, I I think my time here is done and I'll move on to another space. But also, just defining what in your life. works and what doesn't.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
thank you for sharing that.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, it's yeah, I think it's like if you were to ask me the same question 10 years ago, I think I would have had a lot more uh reaction to the idea of rest. And now it's funny because I think when I think of things that are restful today, they're not actually, there are things that are still work. They're like, gardening, they're weeding, they are um, playing with my daughter without having my phone around me. There it's rest, but not in the way of like I'm not at a spa, although a spa would be really nice too. Um, it's like it's about a different kind of presence, and a presence that's oriented around like being in the moment and being a little bit closer to the things that I know are going to be far more important 20 years from now than like those extra emails I could be sending or those extra commitments I could be taking on. Yeah, it's interesting life experiences, and certainly having like different relational expectations and responsibilities has really shifted my sense of what's important. Um, but I also, I mean, the pressures are very real. The things I think about are about living on a planet that is under great distress. I think that the health and well-being of the earth and its waters and its air are something that not only have direct bearing and impact on um, the lives of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis young people, but the whole world over. And I think a lot about that because I think, despite the fact that we know that the world is changing rapidly, that the temperatures are rising, that the the fires are increasing every year in Canada, for example, or the ice lines and the permafrost is moving further and further north. And of course, there will be winters or summers very soon where ice no longer exists. These sorts of things are changing before our very eyes. And within my lifetime, the planet is going to look really different. And despite knowing that it sometimes is really difficult and feels so unjust, that despite our knowledge of that and our political leadership's knowledge of that, um, it feels sometimes like not much is happening to to change that future. And I think that's something that brings me great. That's where my like passion and discontent meet, uh, and I feel a sense of responsibility to really take the climate crisis very seriously, because it's the future that we will leave to future generations. And it's a hot one. It is a warm future, and it is a future that's going to be very different. But of course, that future is connected to racism. The places we live in, the country with the greatest resources of fresh water anywhere in the world, and yet, um, for many First Nations across the country and Inuit communities in the north, the threat of water insecurity and and the ways that it's water access has been made so precarious for so many communities is something that would be intolerable to downtown Toronto or other places which are, the majority of people moving through these places are non-Indigenous people. And so you can see the ways that certain environments are acceptable for some, and then unacceptable for others. And those sorts of places of racial and environmental inequality, to me, are places of real importance, because those are places where young people have to contend with the question of what it means to live a good life when they're dealt an unfair set of cards about the world that they're living in.
Okay,
Um,
so can we just sort of break this down a little bit? Part of what I like to
these,
do in life is break it down into manageable chunks because you're
yeah,
throwing out a whole lot of big things here that I do have concerns about the young people's mental health. I have
yeah,
grandchildren now. I'm a new grandmother, so of course you're worried about that because you have a daughter. When it comes to environmental racism, that's not new. That's been happening for decades and decades and decades.
it's true.
And part of when it came to dealing with my children and the things that they could get overwhelmed by was
Hmm.
let's take a step back and deal with what we have control of. And so as you get older, that evolves into, you let go of what you can't control. But when you get older, then you organize. Then you become part of, governance. That's you said you're a jack of all trades. Well, that's kind of what I am also. I spent 30 years as a musician. I was a family therapist. I do governance consulting right now. I'm sure I'm missing a couple of careers in there. But, I think it's important that we always have hope. And I think
Hmm.
part of what these big conversations do is scare the bejesus out of our young ones.
Mm.
Because if I'm raising my grandchildren in an environment where it feels like, oh my God, the world is changing. It has been ever since my existence, ever since my father's existence. The world has been changing. So how do we offer hope? And I think that's important because that environmental racism is huge. It's huge, but we have to collectively learn to use our voices. We have to
Mm.
collectively learn to work together. Like if
Mhm.
you're that one single voice, then find a platform. Oh, hey, maybe a podcast. Being able to do that because I think it's incredibly important that even if we're offering up these important issues we have to deal with, we also have to offer up hope. And I think that's incredibly important because I certainly wouldn't give my grandchildren a burden that they are not ready to carry.
Mm. Mhm. I think that this question of hope is a really challenging one, um, because the truth that I think a lot of young people navigate who are struggling with mental health concerns is that we want them to feel hope. And even our prime minister talks about hope and how important hope is for young people. But some of the conditions for hope are about seeing the potential of change in the world, or knowing that you can do something that will have an impact. Um, I think when we ask communities to have hope without acting on the things that would make life better now, it can be really it can cause a lot of hopelessness, actually. The ironic thing is it can produce hopelessness. So I think about communities where, for example, lack of access to clean drinking water has existed for decades. It's not an engineering problem. We know how to create water systems that are healthy. It's a political problem, the lack of action on the part of governments to remediate broken water systems. And so that I feel like to tell young people to be hopeful in that situation, without remedying the political problem, would be really unjust. I think that would be unkind, and I don't think it's a fair burden to leave them. Don't feel depressed, but also we're not going to change the water system. Is a really like That's the message that some communities across our country receive today, where there's just this sort of persistent inaction. And so I think you're right. It's that moving to organizing, moving into that position of saying, our community is going to take on power to change the future for our community to make life better. That I think that action, that organizing is life producing. It makes possible another day. Um, and I often see, I feel like as an individual, as a therapist, sometimes, I can admit to the people I work with, I can't change the entirety of colonialism or the violence of environmental racism today. But I do want to ask you, what would make life more possible for one more day? That question of what makes things a little bit better in the here and now, that allows us to keep moving, keep
Mhm.
struggling, to keep organizing, to keep hoping, is, I think, really an important one. Um,
So you
Well, I
mentioned
can
your work in research, and we're talking about suicide and mental health. Do you have any numbers about youth suicide, or our communities dealing with that? Like, what is your work with this research?
well, I think the best kept secret in Canada, we're used to hearing the scary numbers, right? We hear the repeated line over and over about suicides. But the best kept secret in Canada is that the majority of First Nations and Inuit communities, the majority, have almost little to no suicides in them. That's the truth. What
Mm.
we hear about are the statistics about the small number of communities that have really, really high rates of suicide. And
Mhm.
that's important because while that's true, it's also true that there's a lot of communities doing really, really good work to strengthen the mental health and well-being of young people, and their stories are far less often told than the story of distress. Um, but it is true that First Nations and Inuit and Métis young people under the age of 40, that the leading cause of death is suicide.
Mm.
That is a that is not that is not the same as saying, every community has high suicide rates, but it is a leading cause of death, which tells us that the psychological and mental health aspects of people's lives are really, really important, and not being fully addressed by the structures around us. Um,
Mhm.
what my work has really tried to sort of shake up a bit is the idea that the sole reason why people are feeling suicidal is because of mental illness. My work tries to say that there's a bigger context, there's a bigger story than just I'm depressed. That
Mhm.
depression is a part of a much more longer story about why we find ourselves struggling with questions of living and dying.
Mhm. Yeah, well, there's so much interconnectedness between, your external environment, your
Mhm,
down to the cellular, you know, activities in your brain, and dealing with that and making that link is just so interesting. Yeah. Hmm.
mhm. So I kind of trace that out by looking at things like the impact of residential schools, the impact of the child welfare system on mental health and well-being, the impacts of things like environmental racism. Um, also things like uh, when you think about gender or sexuality or age, these are kind of areas that people think, there are greater or lesser degrees of risk, but also things like the economy impact young people's sense of well-being. So the opportunities that are available to you, the resources that are available to you, um, the options for future jobs, those sorts of things. But even, if we took a step back from work a little bit, in societies where people have guaranteed forms of economic support, there tends to be greater stability of mental health. And so, there's lots of creative, interesting ways that we could think about suicide prevention in our country that would really lift people out of economic distress, might be part of the puzzle.
Mhm. Yeah, because that was a huge part of, starting this podcast is that we're having conversations about MAID, and mom's decision to eventually use it, when all treatment options are done, when the disease has progressed to the point that quality of life is a question, then yeah, that sense of agency, that sense of choice, that sense of being treated as a human being,
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
know, being the core of all of these issues that we're dealing with, not having access to clean drinking water, not having access to housing, not having access to, land use,
Mhm.
because that was a huge disappointment, when we started this and we started looking into it, is that Indigenous people are not utilizing MAID. We all
Mm.
have access to it, but the medical field is not offering that option when it's
Mhm.
viable. When a patient comes in and there's nothing else that they could do. We've had conversations with other medical professionals where it's like, yeah, we're we don't really offer that, or there's a gap, or there's all these reasons that they've listed, you know,
Mhm.
but yeah.
I think, just stepping back to Danielle's comment about my choice to use MAID and the agency that gave me so much clarity.
Mm.
And I've heard this about people who have, decided they're going to commit suicide. And there's this feeling where they're just, they feel like the pressure's off. Well, not necessarily to draw that line between MAID and suicide, because there are some people who do say that that's the choice I'm making. But the fact of the matter is, if I had any other choice, I would choose something different. But what that did do was it gave me clarity in
Mm.
the choices I was making in my life.
Mm.
So the little things didn't bother me anymore. The big things, and I remember when I was looking after my mother, well, she was a palliative care patient, was we promised each other that in the 3 months we were told she had to live, and she went on to live almost 3 years, that we were going to do our million I love yous. And so we shared stories. She taught me everything she could in the time she thought she had. And then the million I love yous every day had to have, that. And so there's that buffer. I mean, when I brought up hope, I'm not saying put on rose-colored glasses. We're very big on feeling the feelings. You feel the
Mhm.
feelings when you feel them.
Mhm.
And there is, there are times where you do just have to fall over and cry. There are times where you have to get angry. But, that collective nature of healing is difficult because when you look at the First Nations people in Canada, the wealthy nations have enough money to have their own treasury in Canada. We have so much money. That isn't the issue for everyone every now. Now we have to figure out how do we collectively use that to push our people forward.
Mhm.
How are we able to do that? Because there are just so many nations who don't have what the wealthy nations do.
Mhm. Mhm.
And my nations, we've never. I don't want to say we've never had to worry about water, but we live in a rainforest. If it
Mhm.
became enough of an issue, you figure out how to collect the rain. But those other nations where it is, where hope is difficult, I get it.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so, when I'm saying that collectively, I'm not talking about just a couple of people. I'm talking about Indigenous people in Canada.
Mhm. Mhm.
Let's figure out
Mhm.
how to make life better for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've never been a, I It's not jealousy or anything, but people who are wealthy just come across to me as greedy. Like, at what point do you say enough is enough? I've got enough.
Mhm.
There are points where I just figure I've got enough. I've got enough to share, and that's what our nations. That was the value that we had. You go
Mhm.
out and you go fishing, and you get like 200 salmon. Well, the whole community gets that. And that's what we need to bring back is that sense of community, that sense of belonging. And that's how you bring these voices together.
Mhm.
So if we bring back the communities that we used to have, where we would be able to look after one another and to do it without judgment. If somebody's having a hard time, you give them a hand up.
Mhm.
But the idea of made what that brought out was more of a question of why are indigenous people not using it?
Mhm.
Why don't we, do we feel like we don't have the agency to make that decision? It turns out doctors aren't even offering it because they're afraid. So what we realized was we had to learn then the history of the
Mhm.
medical system in Canada and that racist history of Indian hospitals and, just
Mhm.
the care that we didn't get.
Mhm.
That's changing, and, you brought up, the environmental issues, and I tend to believe that things are getting better. I remember in the '80s where, the huge hole in the ozone layer and they had stopped, the chlorofluorocarbons and refrigeration units. So that's not a thing anymore. And, if you buy a can of tuna, you're going to see it's dolphin friendly now. So things change as you use, we call it the social shopping basket. If this company isn't doing what you think they should be doing, well, don't consume their product.
Mhm.
How do we use our voices, our dollars, just to help direct where we need our society to go?
Mhm.
Mhm. Yeah, because this show, it's at the intersection of medical assistance in dying, family, and our cultures. You know, so from the work that you've done, with suicide studies and health justice, like, how do you think? What do you think about the line between death that's chosen freely and a death that's shaped?
These are such important questions and conversations we're having. Um, I feel like a bumblebee right now, just moving between flowers and hearing like these. There's so many like sweet and important pollens and nectars here. So um, gathering my thinking a little, but I think that why the conversation around MAID is so difficult for us to have, apart from just generally people's existential fears about talking about death. I sometimes have to remember, as somebody who researches death, that it's still very unusual for people to talk about it all the time. Whereas for me, it's like every day I read, I write, I even sometimes have jokes about it, and that scandalizes people because they're so unused to talking and about the topic. But even stepping beyond the just the fear of conversations around MAID, I think for the reasons that we've been discussing, there's this tension between conversations about autonomy and choice versus what it means to live in a world where your choices before you're even born are limited. Um, where things like housing or home care or access to pain management or mental health services isn't fully universally accessible but is accessible to some and not others, so that I think condition of inequity makes the conversation about MAID sometimes really complicated for some. Um, but I do think that what I really see the blessing of MAID as a conversation is that it forces us all to have deep and meaningful conversations about what it means to live well and to die well, to have dignity. Um, I don't think it. I think there's an indignity that communities experience when they don't have access to clean drinking water. I think there's an indignity experience when people in a world as wealthy as ours that has trillionaires where housing can't exist for everyone. I think that kind of indignity makes conversations about death very difficult. Um, but I also think there's a lot of wisdom and opportunity for us to think about MAID through our traditions and languages. Um, as a Cree person, we're taught to think about our life through the language of Wikotoin, or the law of our relatedness to one another. That all things are related, and so I guess some people call that communism. I just think about it as our sense of relationship, that we take care of all of our relations. Um, and so, in a world where not everybody is being taken care of, um, I think I think that the conversation around MAID invites us to think about, well, we owe one another good living, and we owe one another dignity in dying. Um, but also, the my language also gives us the language of Meopimetisuan, or in Nishnabemo and Minabematsuan, this idea of good life. And I think to have good health is also about living well and being in good relationships with others, but part of living well also means dying well. And I think MAID is giving us an opportunity to think really deeply about that again, and to think about, how do we support people at the end of their life? How do we accompany people through that next journey in ways that are, not easy. They're not without pain. They're not without grief. But actually, grief and negotiations of pain are really at the heart of it, about how we show up for one another in those moments. And um, I wish we could have a conversation about MAID in Canada that wasn't already shaped by social, environmental, and economic inequality. I think if all things were equal, it would make conversations about MAID entirely focused on just dignity and autonomy. But because it exists in a world of great injustice, the the fear of the harm of MAID, I think, comes to be louder than maybe its value.
Wow. Wow. I've said it before, but I believe Indigenous people do death and dying well. We have ceremony. We have roles that we fall into. There's a whole, tradition around somebody if their life is coming to an end. And I think you're right. Um, Death can be beautiful. None of us are going to get out of this alive. So being able to experience a death that is just peaceful and loving. I've sat with a few people who have passed away. And all you do is you just feel the love in the room. You send them off on their journey, you know, with all of your love and good intentions and just, wanting to live a good life. And it kind of reminds you to step back. And so when you look at Indigenous death, I think you're entirely correct. We have to reframe that. because I was a little surprised to hear the statistics about Indigenous death because, you hear about how we have the higher incidence of it, and it becomes something that we don't even know how to protect ourselves against. But, you know, death and dying is something we have to talk about, something we have to hold space for.
Yeah. Because, it makes me think, what do our Indigenous communities need from the health system in general, to make sure that end of life decisions, however that happens, how does that come from a genuine choice rather than, being worn down by inequity?
Mhm. Mhm.
But I think a lot of that falls onto us too, though, right? Because we did talk about the wealth of our nations. That was incredible. And the indignities that our people still have to live. Do you know how many nations act like corporations and not nations anymore? They put more money into, building these companies, and their own people are sleeping on the streets. So I think, when you look at those big picture questions, you have to look at the whole answers that include, mental health and, housing and, economic opportunities. And so when it comes to death and dying, you look at how, well, I guess I can say as somebody who's stared down the barrel of that gun, you look at what's important.
Mhm.
My whole academic career has been in governance and policy making. We can do it. We can organize ourselves enough. Stop acting like corporations. Act like a nation that looks after its citizens.
Mhm.
And I think that's where the answer is.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because when it comes to hope, I think we always have to have hope.
Yeah, I think one of the struggles that I often have to work through on this conversation is I guess what people sometimes talk about as the access paradox. That, as you've pointed out, many Indigenous people are underserved by MAID in a context where they might genuinely choose it if they had the option presented to them. But it's also true that they don't have good access to palliative care or to pain management or general mental health services or health services, depending on where you live. And sometimes that's because communities aren't acting like nations and building their own services. Sometimes they're under, in really distressed communities, under third party management by the federal government. And I think I think that that makes things very complicated. But I do think this piece around how do we look to the strengths of our culture, the roles and responsibilities to help people move through different seasons of life, and including because in our worldview, life doesn't end at the point at which our physical bodies die, but new life happens after that. And so, there are lots of things that could be done in the healthcare system. I think that really foreground the wisdom of our cultures in helping people navigate decisions around dying very meaningfully, and the experience of it. I also think, this is maybe less popular for healthcare professionals to talk about, but it's something I think a lot about, which is about spirituality. And that I think this is true in palliative care context. It's certainly true in the conversation about MAID. It's also true in the work that I do in suicide prevention. When I meet young people who are navigating suicidality, I often now talk about how they're in a really important spiritual journey where, as they're moving through this desire to die, they're also going to be permanently changed by negotiating that. that their life is going to have meaning, that there's new life that comes through working through that question. So we're so often in
Mm.
mental health afraid of people's working through the desire to die. But if you really not treat it as something negative, but as something sacred, as something really important, as something that, as you gain clarity about your answer to that question, as you start to think about what makes life meaningful, what gives you purpose, the places where you belong and the relationships where you belong, the hope that comes from that is, I think, deeply spiritual. And it's kind of a spiritual awakening for a lot of people, um, to work through and answer some of those questions. Um, it fundamentally alters and changes how we think about suicide prevention if we think about it as something that is about instilling dignity, that a person is navigating a question of whether to stay alive. And I think the same extends to MAID. You know, if we really treated people's decision making and the opportunities people had as a matter of spiritual care, that that these are deep questions of meaning and belonging and purpose in life, and that just because a person's life ends in the way we might understand it on this side of living, um, there's deep spiritual traditions and knowledges in our cultures that help us understand our purpose in the next life, like what it means to be an ancestor, what it means to be to become part of the stories of our culture. I think is a really like profoundly meaningful opportunity to deepen our healthcare practice. Um, but it does mean we have to appreciate and become more comfortable, in the language and practices of spirituality, um, which is I think a really important but difficult journey.
Oh, that is incredibly profound. That almost shifts my entire perspective of, my childhood, and dealing with mental health issues and even dealing with suicidal thoughts, as a teenager, you know, because it was definitely met with fear, but shifting that into a spiritual experience because there's a sense of guilt to it, you know, when you're dealing with suicidal thoughts of, I can't do this anymore. I can't live on this plane of existence anymore, and almost being happy or at peace with the decision that it's going to be over soon, you know? But then there's the guilt of I'm hurting everybody I'm leaving behind and using that as one of the choices to stay. But realizing that when you take fear out of the equation and you just lean heavily into the spiritual experience of it, wow, like it's just shifted the foundation of my youth. So thank you. That just, yeah,
I think for
gave me a
me
lot to
that
think about.
that moment of like shifting in my own thinking, you know, it's one thing to experience that as somebody who's struggled with the question of living, but it's another thing as a community wrapping around somebody who's navigating that struggle to not look at young people as a problem, but to say, wow, you're like you're you're having a spiritual revolution in our community, and we need to be here to support your journey, and that journey like towards deepening one's sense of meaning, purpose, belonging in the world. And um yeah, it requires being a witness to people's pain. It requires being a witness to people's fears, and also being a truth teller in the midst of what can feel like one is like disconnected from the ground you're on, that it takes a special person to come alongside you and recognize that you're the thing that you're most ashamed to say, but that you're struggling with the question of staying alive. It takes a certain kind of wisdom or presence for somebody to go, I see what you're going through, I recognize it, and the the question that's underlying it is actually good. That question is about what it means to live a good life, and that's a question I want to honor. Like that would alter, it would just fundamentally flip on the, like, upside down how we think about responding to young people in suicidal distress. Um, and it could offer us good lessons, I think, for other kinds of negotiations of the question of living, whether that's living with chronic illness or living with um, other grief. You know, like, there's so many places, but I do think it brings us somewhere new, brings us somewhere different.
Yeah. No, and what a profound perspective, that I just really want to emphasize how much I appreciate this talk, this perspective, this, you know, life shift that we can reframe our experiences in a different way. Because a huge part of this platform has been talking about grief, loss, and how do we heal, you know, and how do we deal with anticipatory grief? How do we deal with, you know, living in a world without our loved ones? You know, and it's all of these existential questions that are avoided in so many spaces. We're afraid of the hard conversations. We're afraid of death and dying, but bringing back these teachings, bringing back these practices, you know, from all of our communities, all of our nations, because we're all very distinct. We're all different, because both sides of my family are from the coast and geographically pretty close together. But when it comes to death and dying traditions, they are vastly different, like their practices, but still hold their own strength. They still hold their own, lessons on how to deal with this. You know, so yeah, thank you. My mind is just a little bit blown, so just settling into this this new truth. You know, so thank you for that. How are you doing, Mom?
I have always feared suicide. I have been touched by suicide. Danielle bringing up her own experience, and thank you for sharing that vulnerability. It just reminded of how scary that was. But, one of the things our family believes is that there's a gift in everything. And even the most horrible things that happen, there's a gift. And so this whole the idea of Danielle having suicidal thoughts when she was a teenager kind of propelled our family onto a healing journey that hasn't stopped because it brought it to the forefront that we have to deal with these issues and the things, like I said, I worry about burdening my children with too much. I worry about burdening my grandchildren with too much. So I have to be able to let them be children. That's where that hope is key. So when we think about what do we want to pass on to the future generations? We want to pass on a way of being, but how do we do that? And what does that entail? Because there are certain ages that suicide is a huge concern. Teenagers, middle-aged men, elders who feel like they've got nothing else to live for. And I remember when I was helping my children walk through those difficult times of trying to figure out why they're on this earth. I went to go speak to an elder, and she was saying, every one of us came to this earth with a contract with the Creator that only you can do. And it's up to you to find it. And so it opens you up to all these different experiences. And I think it kind of goes along the line of that just profound, spiritual awakening that goes with that. And so maybe at these points where we feel like our life is coming to an end, it's actually at the beginning of another spiritual awakening. Because, when I decided to use MAID, yeah, there was a spiritual awakening there. Like I said, it gave me clarity as to who I was. There are many times, too, when I'm talking to young people, and when you have these choices to make, and you decide, who do I want to be at this moment? Because you can always make a poor decision, or do I want to make a decision that's not going to hurt me?
Mhm.
And at that moment of deciding that I wanted to use MAID was something that was a family decision. I had gone to each and every family member and we discussed it. But I love the fact that, there's a shift in perspective here. I live for those moments in my life.
Mhm.
I love when people challenge me or make me think differently.
Mhm. The first time someone invited me into this shift in thinking was an elder named Marianne, who actually her whole life was a midwife. Um, and she kind of made a comment about how some of the best folks working in suicide prevention were actually people who made their work bringing new life into the world. And I think it makes sense, some of these practices around babies being born are also practices about bringing life into the world that are as relevant actually at the end of one's physical life, is about dealing with a similar set of questions about how we leave the world, how we enter the world and how we leave the world. And one thing that Marianne said is that we want people at all times who are navigating the question of dying, whether that's because of psychological distress due to mental illness, or whether that's suicidality, or whether that's a question of dealing with the question of MAID, all very different reasons. But she wants all of us to experience care that is the kind of quality of care we offer to a brand new baby entering the world, which is to say that every person deserves unconditional, generous love at the point that they're navigating a question about dying, that you should feel surrounded by love.
Mm,
And I think that that's a pretty powerful, powerful gift, that is. Yeah.
yeah. No, and we were lucky. Um, mm, I'm very lucky to be born into the family I am because, like Mom said, we don't hold back when we have hard conversations. We are not afraid to go to the difficult places. And so what that meant is that when we had these conversations and when Mom went to every single member of our family to have those, there was no hesitation. There was, I love you. I will support any decision you make. And there is power in dignity. There is power in choice. And to support someone else's decision, because we've seen what happens when that doesn't happen. We know the perspective of not being supported, of being met with fear or with anger or with sadness or with grief or anything else besides. You know, I honor your choice, you know. And so I guess I just ask our listeners to think about that, you know, because none of us are ever going to get out of being in a hospital. None of us are going to get out of, not being ill, because that's just the reality we live in. That's the world we live in, where we get sick. We deal with illnesses, whether it's chronic, whether it's terminal, you know. And it's not to say that these are the answers for you. It's to say, be brave enough to have these conversations. Be brave enough to listen to these questions. Because, like we've said many times during this podcast, we're not about offering you answers. We're about giving you a space where you can have the hard conversations, where you can have, you know, listen to these scary perspectives. Because all of our lives we've been told to be afraid or avoid death and dying. You know, our palliative care and hospice spaces are completely separate from hospitals. Our morgues are in, creepy basements of, you know, medical institutions. But I just really appreciate the resurgence of our practices, our traditions, and fitting them into spaces that were not built for us. Because when my uncle passed, they worked their butts off to honor our traditions, to honor our ceremony. And that meant the world to our family. So when the nurses cleared out a whole family lounge for us, because we needed an open door or an open window for my uncle to pass, they cleared out whole hospital hallways. They cleared out a whole family lounge that opened up to this beautiful garden. So we want to emphasize the importance of spirituality, the power that comes with agency, and the healing that comes with dignity. So whatever space that you're in, whatever you want to learn about, so if there are even young people who are listening to this and you're interested in getting into, mental health, environmental justice, indigenous governance, you know, what would you want them to hold on to?
There's nothing more radical and incredible than being able to imagine yourself into the future. If you can imagine something beyond the moment, you have the capacity to get there. And every day we get one step towards that vision by taking little, tiny, seemingly insignificant steps towards that future. But they add up. And I don't know. I didn't think I would graduate from high school, let alone become a professor or a psychologist. I certainly didn't think I'd at one point live long enough to become a partner or a parent. Um, but it took a little imagination a little improvisation, and a lot of good people showing up for each other to get me to where I am today. And I guess what I want those young people who might be listening, who are questioning like their meaning, their purpose, and their belonging in the world, um, to know is that to never underestimate the power of what you can imagine. Because if you can imagine it, if you can take little steps towards that future, and you can find one other person in your corner, you'll be amazed at what's possible. And I know that doesn't make the whole world better in a moment, and it doesn't take away the intensity of the pain that you might be holding as a person. But I guess what I'm saying is I really believe that you have power, that inside you, that you have some strong medicine that can carry you, and that can um, not only lead you into the future, but that the future needs you. The future has important things to learn from you. Um, and I also would say that I think like I want you to know it's really like those questions are nothing to be ashamed of. That those questions are really important questions. They're valuable questions, and sometimes people might make you feel bad for having them, but believe in who you are, um, and follow the places that open up to you. You know, hold fast to the people around you that lift you up,
Mhm.
because those are going to be the people that really matter in the long term. Um,
Yeah. No, there was a quote that really shifted my perspective when I was younger, where it's like, whenever there's doubt, whenever there's, I don't know, even a sense of weakness, or struggling, it's like, I'm descended from the best of the best. We were built into a world that wanted to erase us.
mhm,
So I am the result of the resilience. I
mhm,
am the result of a systemic failure of erasing my family, of erasing my community. So it's, you know what? You tried to get rid of us, but you failed because I'm
mhm,
still here and I know who I am and I know where I come from. And there's a peace and a strength that comes with that. Because I've said before, it was hard.
mhm,
It's hard having these conversations. It's hard showing up
mhm,
in such a genuine and authentic way in order to honor this platform.
mhm,
But these life lessons, they helped me. They helped my family. And now they're gonna help my nibblings, my my nephew and my niece. I am so grateful that they get to come into a world where our family has done the work and will continue to
mhm,
do the work
mhm,
that we're gonna. Because healed, that's never the destination. Healing, that's just a constant day-to-day practice. And, because throughout this podcast and throughout, the whole journey with my mom is figuring out how to take care of ourselves. You know, one of the things we say on the podcast is, self-care is mandatory.
mhm,
Figure out how to take care of yourself.
mhm,
So
mhm.
what is there anything happening in your work right now, where you'd want the community or the listeners or anybody to know about or learn about?
Well, I think one thing I would just say is the whether because I know the focus of this journey has been around relating to MAID, and I guess I would just say that the thread that I see is connected to all of my work, whether we're talking about environmental racism or mental health or youth suicide prevention, and also MAID, is that at the foundation of it, the foundation of justice is also about dignity. And there's a common thread about how to live a good life is connected across all of these struggles. But the solution is also about struggling together and working together. Um, in terms of the things that I would point to from the current work, it's really to really build on what's been said, I think, a little bit earlier about taking taking really seriously the value of our cultural perspectives and traditions and practices as being not only interesting and important, but vital to the future. That those have a place not only in our healthcare system, but in all aspects of our community life and education. And um, yeah, there's such an incredible amount of work to do in bringing that to the front of our communities. And also, there's a that sometimes people feel like that's just work for the older ones. But I actually think the most important people to be at the core of that work are young people, because how we see that work rippling out into the future is through deep relationships between those who hold this knowledge and young people. And so there's no good Indigenous child and youth work without Indigenous elders. There's no good family work without the presence of people who are younger. There are not any kind of good governance work that doesn't include the full range of our communities of experiences and life stages. Um, and so, yeah, I hope that communities really think about that. And I think the other thing I'll just say, coming from a community that's been really impacted by colonialism and where our connection to language and traditions is sometimes been destabilized. Sometimes you just got to do some good improvisation. It's okay if it's not perfect. It's okay if it doesn't look like it all looked 100 to 500 or 1,000 years ago. In our stories of creation, we come from the stars, and those stars that we see in the night sky are our ancestors. And um, whether we get it perfect or not, those ancestors are still watching over us. And I think they're going to see the love that's nourishing our imperfect movements. And I think that's better than not doing anything at all. Um, how's that?
No, I like that. I like that because what that does is that we have these traditions, but these traditions have evolved and they continue to evolve. We don't live the way they did, hundreds of years ago, and so they'll evolve to what's important to us now. I love the idea of the ancestors looking down on us, but in that whole human approach to life, it's gonna get messy, we're gonna fall down. But, I like the idea of love, you know, guiding us. And if you I tend to think if you lead with your heart, you're doing the right work.
Mhm. Yeah. And realizing that it's our own personal responsibilities to bring that back. You know, m colonization impacted every single one of our nations, every single one of our communities and families. But I realized as I got older, it was my responsibility to build it back. So it's my responsibility to listen to my elders, to really hold on to their stories and their practices, and also learning my own language, realizing that it just needs to be a day to day habit where it's like, you know what? Once I learn that word, I'm not going to speak the English equivalent to it. anymore because it's yeah, once you grow up, you realize that the only shifts that we can make in our realities are from ourselves, because the systemic issues are never gonna go away. We're gonna continue to deal with those. And so when it shifted to, "This is what I can do, this is what I can change in my family, in my community," there's still power in that, there's still change in that, because all of that has a ripple effect. You know, the fact that my grandparents made changes, that my parents made changes, that everybody committed to evolving the next generation. So it was a family rule, you push the next generation up. And it wasn't about being better than or any sense of hierarchy. It's give them the best chance for this world, you know. And that came at a huge opportunity cost. So that meant we didn't live in our community. We didn't live in our reserve, but everyone was educated. Everyone went out to college and university and built careers. So with that, yeah, I do have a responsibility to go back, and that's part of healing. That's part of self-care because that connection to my culture is powerful. There's a sense of being grounded. There's a sense of belonging, because I can stand on a beach that's where my family's been for over 13,000 years old. And that, yeah, like I said, it's powerful. You know, yeah. But I think before we check in with each other, I just want to remind our listeners that we will have, links to resources in our show notes. So if you are dealing with anything, mental health crises, family, intergenerational trauma, reach out, figure out how to take care of yourself. You know, Jeffrey, do you have any resources that you'd like to mention?
Well, yeah, I think if anyone here is dealing with, you know, concerns about their mental health or questions about living and dying, I think, it's really important to talk to people you trust. Um, and I'll just be honest, sometimes when you share that with people, they get scared. They care a great deal about you, they worry about you, and they love you, and so, of course, they're gonna be afraid at first, just like you maybe were afraid when you first felt those feelings. So, as much as possible, try to be patient with them as they kind of awkwardly move through what to say and do, but it's important to talk to those people, to share how you're feeling, to let them know that you have a story that you want them to understand. If you feel like you're really without that kind of person, I think it's important to reach out for help. There's Depending on where you live in Canada, anywhere you live in Canada, you can always call 988, which is it's kind of like a hotline, support line. There's really wonderful people who'd love to talk to you and try to get you connected to help wherever you live. There's also the Hope for Wellness hotline if you're living on a First Nation in Canada, and that hotline offers services sometimes in Indigenous languages. But these are resources that you can connect to, and I think in addition to that, if you're interested in learning about different people's stories, I really there's this really wonderful website called wisepractices.ca that just shows the different efforts that our communities across Turtle Island are trying to make to really promote and value life, and good life. And I think the last thing I'll just say is there's nothing more powerful than a friend. And I think one of the things I've learned from talking through my own pain or issues that I've experienced with friends is how oftentimes when I think I'm really alone in my experience, I often discover that I'm surrounded by people who are navigating the same waters. And um, sometimes you can open up a conversation like that by asking a question. Hey, do you ever feel this way? Um, Sometimes I feel like this. Is that something you've ever experienced? And you'd be amazed at how much that sharing with each other can help open up a really meaningful conversation. Sometimes we just got to take a risk and try to talk about it with each other. Um, and I think that I would also say when you're doing that, ask people what's worked and what's helped them. It's not just about, oh, we're all going through difficult things. It's also like, well, what have you done that's helped you? I'd love to learn from what worked for you. And it's amazing the things that people tell you. For me, it was getting outside. I've mentioned gardening earlier, but I go on hikes, I go walk down by the water. I find that something about that changes my body and it changes and reawakens something in my spirit that helps me. Well, somebody told me to do that once, and it was amazing when I started doing it how I felt differently. So really just asking and seeking. I mean, you said like learning to take care of ourselves is it's communal work and we learn from other people's journeys too. Um, but a lot of times we're stuck in our own minds and our own lives that when we just ask those questions, you'll be amazed at what can open up.
I'm good. I'm good. You really got me thinking about a lot of different things. Jeffrey, I really appreciate you coming on to our podcast. There are a whole lot of big things that I think I need to process, but I really appreciate just sort of the conversation you had with our listeners about here's how do you reach out for help? How do you do? And I the only thing I would add to that is that if you keep talking until you find somebody who hears you. You may have to say it a few times, but you'll find the person who will hear you, will understand you and see you. And I think that's important because there are some people go, "Yeah, I tried, but nobody listened," so there is that idea of just keep going until you find what you need. Um, I think it's really got me thinking about sort of I was at that period where I was thinking about the end of my life. And this started the conversation around MAID. And then I got a treatment and that changed everything. And you know, I'm still here. And it made me think about how do you make sense of the uncertainty between preparing for death and continuing to live. And that was all back to, my mom's story. And I've told the story on earlier podcasts about after what was that, 26 rounds of chemo, Danielle, something like that. Um, she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer and was given 3 months to live. And went, like I said, went on to live for nearly 3 years. And after 26 rounds of chemo, the doctors came and said, "I'm sorry, there's nothing else we can do." And so they gave us a book and wrote out all her end of life decisions, and just I am crying as I'm writing everything down, and it was just ripping my heart out. And in what seemed like forever, we closed up the book and we put it somewhere else. And she picked up another book and she goes, "I think I'll write my PhD on Native nations and spirituality." And I'm still snorkeling, and I have cried my way through I'm dehydrated. I've cried so much. I said, but you're dying. You're dying. And she goes, "No, I'm not. Until I take my last breath, I'm living." And so that's where I found, how do I make sense of that uncertainty of preparing for death, but still living a good life? And that's what you got me thinking about. Danielle, how are you?
Yeah, like I said earlier, light bulb went off, foundation of some memories were shifted. And so, yeah, I think I'm just going to take some time to process that because, you know, getting rid of the stigma of dealing with mental health, with suicidality, with grief, with loss, with death, with dying. These are always like scary topics for people. And I'm just grateful that we can create a space where we can talk about it, where we can deal with it, where we can share honesty, guidance, and so much wisdom, And so, yeah, my world is shifted. My memories are kind of flowing out. So, yeah, I'm grateful. So even though I cry, even though I'm sad, even though I'm still dealing with grief, like you said, there's still a gift in it. There's still a lesson. There's still profound feelings and experiences that come with it, you know. So thank you. Thank you, Jeffrey, for joining us. Thank you for being so open and honest and vulnerable with us, because that's where, you know, life shifts happen is that when we create this community where we can talk about this, where we can deal with this. So thank you so much for joining us. For all of our listeners, figure out how to take care of yourself. Self-care is mandatory.
I have walked through dark and light. I have loved with all my might. Every scar and every mile brought me here. And when the road grows thin, and when the night rolls in, before I go.
Thank you so much for joining us, and take care of yourselves. Self-care is not a choice, it's mandatory. Figure out how to take care of yourself.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope our conversations provided a unique perspective, opened the door to your own discussions, and offer some comfort. If you have any questions or would like to learn more about anything we've discussed or haven't discussed, let us know in the comments. Until next time, at Lugo Doixip Noon. Before I go, gratefully acknowledges the financial support of the Indigenous Screen Office.